Welcome back, everybody. This is the third and final section of this episode about healthy and unhealthy relationships. If you haven't listened to the first or second part, I do recommend that you go listen to those first before you get to this. In those two episodes, I share a little about two unhealthy relationships I've been in, and I promise you, I have been in so many unhealthy relationships, unhealthy dating relationships, unhealthy friendships. We are so vulnerable to experiencing secondary abuse, which means because we were abused by our mothers, the effects that abuse had on us makes us vulnerable to being in unhealthy relationships with harmful people, and we end up being mistreated even more. Now, we can't change the fact that we were abused by our mothers. That just simply is, and we have to learn to carry on a good life in spite of that. But we can change our vulnerability to secondary abuse, and that means that we can take actions to make sure that we aren't mistreated to that degree moving forward. And that's good news. If you've struggled with unhealthy relationships, you may feel like you can't trust yourself, or you can't trust others, or both. Maybe you feel like people, yourself and others included, are just not trustworthy, and then you isolate yourself from the world. Or even when you're having relationships, you keep yourself guarded and isolated. I hope that the information in this episode will help you see that we don't have to live that way. And no, there's nothing we can do to ensure that we are not hurt by other people. But we can take steps to greatly reduce the risk of the really painful, deep hurts. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And that really just comes from understanding the signs of healthy and unhealthy relationships. And this may seem very complicated, but it really comes down to three issues. So the first issue is this. In a healthy relationship, there is communication. And by that I mean both participants communicate their boundaries and needs. I have a really close friend, and we have some needs that are kind of silly in a way, just in that they're unusual and can seem insignificant, but their effects on us are not insignificant, so they're important. One is I have a sensory disorder called misophonia, and it means I cannot tolerate a lot of mouth and nose sounds. They just affect me very severely, to the point that I have to leave if there's a lot of it going on. It's a really annoying problem to have. There's no known treatment, unfortunately. So loud eating, like people chewing with their mouths open or talking with food on their mouths, is absolutely intolerable to me. Now, it's funny in a way because my mom was one of the loudest eaters in the world, I swear, and maybe that's why I have this disorder. But when I became a teenager and was able to communicate that better, well, she would just do it even more around me. And so maybe that's why, my case of misophonia is very severe. Well, my friend is a pretty loud eater, and I've had to communicate with her about how it affects me. And then she's had to make some accommodations for that. Well, I do something that tends to bother her. For whatever reason, if I'm sitting on a couch or a chair, I tend to move one of my legs, repetitively. I just kind of, rock it back and forth, or I don't know why I do that, but I just do it without even realizing I am. And that just drives her crazy. So it's kind of a joke between us, but it's also serious. Sometimes I'm doing it and I don't realize it. So she just goes, leg, and then I realize I'm moving my leg, so I stop. And of course, there are more serious boundaries to establish in relationships than that. I'm just giving an example of a couple, kind of funny ones, but I say funny in just that they're unusual and it doesn't make sense why these things bother us, but they are important because they bother the person. The point is, just sitting there saying nothing while a person is upsetting you or they're driving you crazy and they don't even know, that lack of communication will cause the relationship to have problems, because the person not communicating their needs, they're just going to get more and more upset and bothered while the other person doesn't even know that that is happening. And that's going to build, and eventually it can cause the relationship to fail. So communication is key. Both people need to feel comfortable communicating their boundaries and needs, or even if one is not comfortable. And for us, let's be honest, sharing our boundaries can be very hard, because look what has happened for years and years of our lives when we communicated a boundary to our mothers. Because they are narcissists, they respond to that in the way a narcissist does. They feel attacked and they lash back. They get very angry, and then they'll do it to you even more. So it's normal for us to be fearful and uncomfortable stating boundaries, because so much of the time that has resulted in things being much worse. But communicating your boundaries and needs is important in a relationship. So even if you're uncomfortable because of your history, it's important to feel comfortable communicating it with your friend, meaning you may feel awkward, you may feel uncomfortable, but at the same time, you have the trust in your friend that he or she is not going to react that way. And so you do it anyway, even though you have these underlying fears. I hope that makes sense. And if you feel very uncomfortable in all your relationships with this, it could be that you have a lot of unhealthy relationships and you know it won't go well. It could be that your relationships are healthy and you just need to practice that more. And so as you do, and you state your boundaries and these terrible things don't happen in response, that fear will start to go down, and then you will get more comfortable. If you have healthy relationships, let those friends help you work through those fears. And in fact, that can be a communication of a need right there, that I struggle with establishing boundaries and communicating my needs because of the way my mother treated me, and I need help learning to be better at communicating that. Will you help me with that? That's stating a need. In healthy relationships, both members of the relationship communicate their boundaries and needs. Now, kind of extending off of that, in a healthy relationship, there is respect. So when my friend and I are together and she shouts, "Leg," I realize I'm moving my leg and I stop. I don't just keep doing it and tell her what my mother would say, well, if you don't like it, leave the room. Because, of course, everything revolved around her and what she wanted and her needs, and never about the other. When my friend is eating loudly without realizing it, I point it out, and she stops doing so. It doesn't matter to her if it makes sense why it bothers me. She doesn't have misophonia. She doesn't understand what it's like. She doesn't need to understand what it's like. She just respects that I'm stating this bothers me, so she doesn't do it around me. When a boundary is established in a healthy relationship, it will be respected. Now, think about my relationship with Alex in the second part of this episode. I established a boundary with her about her commenting about my parenting my child who is disabled and has some special needs. She has never faced anything like that. And also, I've dealt with so much judgment and unsolicited advice from not just in relationships, from complete strangers. Like, as if I can give an example, when my son was 2, my son spent most of the first year of his life in the intensive care unit. He was born 3 months early. He also has a complex congenital heart defect, which is completely unrelated to his premature birth. And those two situations combined made a very serious and complex medical situation for many months after he was born. Well, babies who go through that tend to have a lot of problems with anxiety, and that shows early on. My son is 10 now and still has significant issues with anxiety, but when he was 2, just, so much of his life, so much had been so scary to him that everything scared him. So when we went to the grocery store, he was just screaming and crying almost all the time. If a light flickered, or there was a loud sound, like say someone was, loading some shelves and they dropped a box on the floor, or even just someone bumped a cart into one of the aisles. Just little things would set him off on these very loud screaming, and there was nothing I could do to calm him down. He'd be closing his eyes, just completely shutting out the world. And a therapist had recommended to me that what I should do when that happens is to not try to soothe him, as much as that goes against our intuition, because by doing that, I'm actually communicating that something really bad must be happening. Instead, I am supposed to just carry a countenance of confidence, like everything is safe, and he will start to pick up on that. And so what I did is I went to the store every single day for about 10 minutes. And that's what I did. Something would happen where he'd be screaming. Sometimes I didn't even need anything. We'd just go to the store to practice this. And I would just carry this countenance of everything is fine. Everything is safe, and there's nothing to do about it. And a few months later, he finally started to get better because of that. And that was after a year of dealing with this with no improvement. So it did work. Eventually, it got to the point where he never screamed in stores, and it was just so amazing. And we worked so hard to get there. But anyway, while I was doing this, do you know how many people came up to me and just, you should carry Cheerios with you so when he's hungry, you have something to give him. Like really angry with me and judgmental of me. Well, the irony is my son could not eat at the time. He had a stroke after his first heart surgery, and for a variety of reasons, he was unable to eat by mouth until he was 4 years old. And he was fed with the feeding tube, so Cheerios would have done him no good because he could not eat them. Also, he had a lot of GI problems, and it's hard for people to understand this, but he truly never got hungry. If he was having a medical procedure where he couldn't eat the entire day before, it didn't even make a difference in his behavior. He never felt thirst or hunger. That's very common in the situation he was in. So he wasn't even hungry. That's not even what was wrong. And like literally every day we would go do this, and it was hard enough to do because my baby is, well, he was 2, but he was little. My child was screaming in terror, and of course every fiber of my being wanted to comfort and soothe him. So it was very hard to just carry this countenance of everything is okay. And then when you add to that, these people coming up to me angry and yelling at me about stuff that they had no idea what they were talking about. And many friends would give me advice that was unsolicited and had nothing. It was just not helpful. It wasn't right. I mean, for example, me talking about my son not being able to eat. He had a sensory, he still has it, but it's much better. He has a sensory disorder called oral aversion, and many children that go through really extreme medical issues. He was on ventilators. A lot of terrible things were happening with his mouth. Basically what happens is the brain, because they're an infant and the brain is still kind of establishing its relationship with the world around it, it decides stimulation to my mouth is scary and bad, and it sort of cuts that off. So any stimulation to the mouth or face just causes gagging and vomiting and pain and terror, and the child cannot eat because of it. And I don't know how many people came up to me and would just, this is a very severe disorder. It takes years to overcome, years of daily work of slowly desensitizing the face and the mouth. It's just a really challenging situation. And I would try to explain this to people, and inevitably the person would just say, well, just give him some ice cream and then he'll know food is good and then he'll eat. Like, why would we have specialists with master's degrees to treat this if it was really that simple? So, by the time I became friends with Alex, I had already endured years and years of unsolicited advice that frankly was just stupid advice and very frustrating and very invalidating of the serious situation I was facing. And so by then, I had become so intolerant of that happening to me, because it was happening from practically everyone in my life and strangers everywhere I went. I just didn't want to deal with it anymore. Now, I had long established that boundary with my other few friends, and they were respecting it. And then that incident happened with Alex, and of course, I just, I did get very upset. I had to walk away for a while and calm myself down. And then I did calm down, and I sat down and I explained why that is so traumatic to me, why it's so upsetting to me, and why it's so intolerable. And the bottom line is she didn't respect that. Like, she kind of seemed to in the conversation, because she was calm. She wasn't attacking me. She was advising me, which wasn't appropriate in that situation. But she was just so calm, and she did listen to me as I talked. And so I sort of felt like everything was okay. But over time, it became clear that she did not respect that boundary. For example, a few months later, she just made the comment to me it was actually in a Facebook post I made that this didn't even have anything to do with what was being talked about, so it was weird. She just said, "Your traumas and triggers are your responsibility, not mine." And she was just constantly inserting little hints about my parenting, definitely not as forward as it was before I had that conversation with her. But she would just find any little chance that she could sneak something in, kind of like implied, and like indicating that I need to toughen up my son so he'll be a real man someday, and I need to put soap in his mouth, and I need to beat his ass, and I need to do all this stuff. Which is, I would assume you're aware, these are very archaic methods of parenting that no expert in child behavior or child psychologist would ever advise. But the point is, she did not respect that boundary I established. And I want to address here this statement that I hear a lot, that your traumas and triggers are your responsibility, not mine. That is not true when you're in a friendship with somebody. If somebody has a legitimate trauma, and something triggers that trauma, and they're my friend, it is my responsibility to avoid that. I think these words have been so overused and misunderstood that it has led to this idea that if you're triggered by something, that you're weak or you can't handle yourself and you just need to buck up. Well, if you've had real traumas, like what I went through with my son, of course that was traumatic. My son was in an intensive care unit for almost a year. I mean, how do you not come out of that horribly traumatized? There were a lot of things that happened where my son almost died multiple times right in front of my eyes. It was traumatic, and we all have traumas from what we went through with our mothers. And if you're in a healthy relationship, you should be able to communicate to that person you're in a relationship with, whether it's dating, friendship, marriage, whatever, even a relative. You should be able to state, I have had these past traumas that really affected me and damaged me. And it's very upsetting to me when a person does this. Please don't do that around me. Of course you can say that. And if the person doesn't respect that, you are not in a healthy relationship with that person. My goodness, if I can respect my friend's need for me to not be repetitively moving my leg, which is so simple and basic, surely you can have real traumas that you have experienced be respected. When Alex did not respect that boundary and the communication of that need, that was a sign that the relationship was not healthy. I miss them because it seemed so minor compared to what my mother did to me. When I would set a boundary with her, she would get very angry and enraged and attack me, and she would then purposely and eternally do more of what I asked her not to do. So just inserting little hints here and there, well, that is comparatively minor. She did tone it down at least, but she didn't stop. But that didn't really stand out to me as a problem because behaviors that are so much worse had been so normalized to me. But I've grown in my understanding of these issues. And now I know, if I establish a boundary with a friend, if I communicate one of my needs, and they don't respect it, well, it might be time to pull back and reevaluate that relationship. Because as you know, my relationship with Alex ended up causing me a lot of pain. You could probably hear in my episode, it was very difficult for me to talk about without those emotions and pain coming through. Now, granted, this was very recent, and I know that's going to get better, but I could have been spared from all of that if I had just been more aware of these problems earlier in that relationship and not allowed myself to get so close and attached to her. Now, it's also important to remember in a relationship, this goes both ways too. We need to respect boundaries people establish with us. We never had the example on how to do that. And when I was younger, like in my early 20s and in my teen years, I didn't respect other people's boundaries. I never had the example on how to do that. It wasn't modeled in front of me. And so I kind of reacted like my mother did. If somebody asked me not to do something, or they said, I don't like it when you do such and such, I saw it as an attack because that's what my mother did, and I would get really angry. I would feel attacked. Now, I wouldn't do it more to get back at them. I never did that, but I would get really mad, and then I would, it would always erupt into an argument about how they shouldn't be asking that of me, and there's no problem with what I'm doing. And this caused a lot of problems in my early relationships. So, over time, I grew and got better about that. There's a word for this in the world of children of narcissistic parents, if you didn't know. These behaviors are called fleas. And what is meant by that is this: we aren't narcissists. But because we were raised by a narcissist, we can take on learned behaviors that we witnessed throughout our upbringing from the narcissist, because that's what children do. Parents model a behavior in front of their children, and their children take it on. So unfortunately for us, the behaviors modeled for us were narcissistic behaviors. And so even though we aren't narcissists, we can have certain behaviors that are like narcissists. I tended to blame problems in relationships on the other person earlier in my life. I didn't reflect on my own self. I never thought about my own contribution to problems in my relationships very well. Those are narcissistic behaviors. I'm not a narcissist, but I was going with the behaviors that were modeled to me. And that's why a lot of times when people like us learned that our mothers are narcissists and we start to read about the signs, there can be this moment of oh my gosh, am I a narcissist too? Because I've done some of these things. I do some of these things. Well, the fact that you're asking that question is a good sign that you're not a narcissist, because you're reflecting on yourself enough to show that that's not true. But narcissists never reflect on their own behavior. The good news is, if you have these fleas, these learned behaviors, because you're not a narcissist, you can change them. Narcissists can't. They cannot change. They never will change. That's why they never do change. But you can. I had a moment in my mid-20s that was really profound for me, and I don't even know what it was about this that made it click, but my brother had come to visit me. I lived several states away from my family. My brother's 10 years younger than me, so he was still a teenager, and I was out living on my own, and he had come to spend his spring break with me. And we had pulled in the driveway. The trunk of the car was open. We were getting his bags out. And I was just getting ready to close the trunk of the car, and he realized something was left in the trunk. So he thought I could see him, and he reached back in the car and leaned down. Well, I didn't see him, and I started to close the trunk of the car, and I hit him on the head pretty hard, and he just grabbed his head and was like, ow! My first instinct was to blame him. I was about, probably 24 at the time, and it was, I almost said, well, why did you put your head there when I was getting ready to close the trunk? And it just hit me. He's in a lot of pain right now. Why would I be yelling at him? And I said, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? And had a completely different reaction. And later I started to wonder, why was my first instinct to yell at him? And I realized I tended to do that to people. If anything went wrong, I would get on them for what they did to make it happen. And it just dawned on me. I had no idea my mom had narcissism at the time. And I was in contact with my mother, and, we didn't have a good relationship, but I just had never thought about these things. But I realized that's what my mom did to me. I think what happened was, because I had become an adult and I was out in the world, well, now my mother wasn't the one modeling most of the behaviors that I saw. I was being exposed to lots of other ways to be. And so after several years of that, my brain sort of processed that, hey, people don't act this way when they accidentally hurt someone. And from then on, I was more aware of myself in those situations. I was much more quick to apologize, to ask if the person is okay or what I could do. We do have the ability to self-reflect because we don't have narcissism. And so if you have any of these learned behaviors, or if you're older and you can recognize when you were younger that you had some of these, well, that's what happens. You had fleas and you were able to get rid of them. And if you have some of them now, and you probably do, I still do to a degree, we can still change our behavior. We can learn to expect respect from people we have relationships with. And in time, that means the relationships in our lives will be with people who respect us. And that can be really wonderful, especially to people like us who know what it's like to not have that. But it's also important that we're honest with ourselves and see if we are falling short on showing that same respect to others. We need to have the self-awareness and the confidence that's required to acknowledge when we haven't done so successfully and to work on it. That's narcissists' problem. As egotistical as they seem, the real irony is their problem is they have no ego at all. It takes a certain amount of ego or self-esteem to be able to admit when you're wrong, because you have to be able to see, okay, I was wrong in this situation, but I'm still a decent person. That comes from a basic amount of ego or self-esteem. Narcissists don't have that, and so they always have to be right. They don't have that ability of, well, I was wrong, but I'm still okay, because we all ultimately need to feel okay with ourselves. For a narcissist, the only way they can feel okay with themselves is to always be the one who's right. Well, we're not like that. Even if our self-esteems are very low, which would be understandable, we still have one. And so as we build our self-awareness, as we build our self-esteem, our sense of self-value, we become more able to see, okay, I really don't have this skill well. There's a deficit here, but I'm still okay, and I'm still a good person, and I'm going to get better about it. So be honest with yourself. And I have to admit, there have definitely been times I was not showing respect in my relationships with others, and so it's not surprising that the relationship was unhealthy. Now, granted, at that time in my life, pretty much just about every relationship I had in my life was with a person who couldn't do this either. The relationship was unhealthy no matter what I would have done. But I did play a part in the unhealthy parts of that relationship, and acknowledging that empowers us to do better so that we can have healthy relationships with other people. You're not a bad person if you've struggled with this. You're doing what's normal for a person to do, to take on the behaviors modeled to us by our parents. We do this without even knowing it. But it's our responsibility now that we're adults and can think and reflect on these things to work on them. And you can. And by practicing these skills, eventually they will become normal for you if they haven't already. You'll just do it without thinking. It just takes time. So grant yourself grace, love yourself, and work on it. Expect respect of others and show others respect. The third big component of a healthy relationship is this. Both members of that relationship have and express interest and care for one another. I've had a hard time with this in my relationships. I've had friendships with people who really don't show much care for me. I've dated people who don't show much care for me. In all of these situations, what usually happened was the person did do something kind or caring for me. Like when Alex and her husband helped us repair the roof on our camper. Because I so consistently felt unloved by my mother, and so desperately wished, and still wish, that hadn't been the case. When someone does something nice for me, I have tended to see them in this amazingly positive light, and then after that I would look past all their faults, no matter how bad those faults were. I would just seize to that moment where I felt so cared about and loved, and I would continue seeking that even when I was not being treated with care and love. And this has made me just really vulnerable to secondary abuse. The effects of my mother's abuse toward me has caused me to experience poor treatment from others, so I end up being mistreated even more. If you listen to the second episode, you'll know on multiple occasions when I tried talking to her about something that was really upsetting to me, not anything she was doing, just things that happened in my life. She didn't care at all about how I was feeling, and she did nothing to comfort me. She basically just invalidated my feelings every time. And she just never really expressed any interest in me as a person. Like, what did I like to do? Or how was my day? Or what have I been up to? She just never cared. She never asked. If I tried sharing, she just really wasn't paying much attention. My son and I were traveling full time at the time, and she didn't really even seem interested in where we were or what we were doing. And I didn't notice these red flags at all. And I've been in many relationships like this, where they just expressed no interest in me or my life. And that's because my mother expressed no interest in me as a person or in my life. It just seemed perfectly normal to me to be treated this way. Now, add on top of that, I have tended towards similar behaviors toward my friends. I do have interest in my friends and what they're doing or thinking about, but I did not know how to express that interest or care. Like just the simple thing of asking them questions about it. I never came home from school as a child and was asked how my day went. Things like that never happened. And so I really didn't know that people expect to be asked questions about their lives. And if we don't ask questions, most people are going to feel like we're not interested in them or their lives, because they did grow up in a home where people asked each other about their day and how things were going, so that's normal to them. So then if they meet us and start to become friends with us and we don't do that, they start to think, wow, she doesn't even care about me. But the thing was, I actually did care. I do care. I actually was very interested. I just thought if they wanted to tell me something that they would bring it up. And if they didn't bring it up, that must mean they didn't want to talk about it, and it'd be really rude to ask. This is another one of those fleas, the learned behaviors. And if your mother was a neglectful type of narcissist, like mine was, it's very common for us to develop these problems. Now, on the other side of that, if your mother was the enmeshed type of narcissist, you might have the opposite problem. You ask too many questions, you get too involved because that's what's been normalized to you. I just want to emphasize again, because I don't want to be casting any seeds of doubt in any of you listening to this, this does not make you a narcissist if you have these problems. It's normal to learn behavior from our parents. And I also want to remind you of the good news. We can unlearn and change these behaviors. I had to start practicing asking people questions. I'm still working on this skill. I'm much better at it now, but I definitely still have much farther to go. It can be uncomfortable or even scary because I worry that I'm being intrusive or I'm upsetting them. But the more I do this and people don't get upset, those fears are going down and it's getting easier. In a healthy relationship, the two participants ask each other questions to express interest in the other. That's normal. Another problem I have is that I tend to dominate conversations and to talk a lot about myself. And I've also learned this is very common for scapegoat children. again, is a learned behavior. My mother talks endlessly, just telling the most boring stories. In fact, recently I was talking about this problem with my brother and his wife, and we've talked about this a lot because I'm working on it really hard. And we talked about how my mom does this too, and my brother's wife said, at least when you do this, your stories are actually interesting. Your mom's are not. Like, we have to listen to her talk forever about every detail of her dentist appointment when, like, none of it was interesting at all outside of I went to the dentist is all that would have been necessary to say. When I was growing up, not asking people questions about their lives and talking only about oneself is what I saw day in and day out. I didn't see anything else happening. So I just didn't get the chance to develop better social skills on these matters. And if you have the same issue, like, this is nothing to feel shamed about. You're just doing what people do. They're taking on modeled behaviors from their parents. But like I said before, we can change. We can learn these skills. We can even master these skills over time. And that means we can have better relationships moving forward. It's not my fault I've had these issues. If you have these issues or others, it's not your fault. How could we have developed better skills? Well, here's what I did. As I've mentioned in the past, my son and I spent 2 years living in an off-grid travel trailer, and we traveled full-time. I work remotely. I was able to do that. Well, traveling in that way, you're out there alone, and we need relationships. We need to socialize. We need to connect with others at a minimum. And so, kind of just out of my own needs to be able to chat with people and connect with people, I would push myself to go up to people, to meet them, and to ask them questions about themselves. And I mean, sometimes that meant sitting in a small restaurant and some people came in and we invited them to sit with us, or we'd be at a festival and invite people to sit with us there if we were eating, or talk to people while we're in line at the grocery store, or just wherever we were, to strike up conversations with the people around us. And that was really good practice for me, because I think I felt more safe in that setting, because I knew I'd never see these people again. If you're standing in line at the grocery store with somebody, you're just not, very unlikely to ever come across them again. So I felt more free to just try it out and observe their reactions. Like, was I being too nosy? Did they think I was weird? All these things I was worried about that would happen. Well, you know what? No one ever acted the way I feared they would. They were always happy to answer my questions and really just showed big smiles of warmth, like they just felt very cared about, and they enjoyed answering my questions. And then they would start talking more, and we'd open up and just have a really great conversation. That expression of care towards them, even from a stranger, just opens people up. And it was really beautiful and wonderful. And doing that in those settings, that's given me the courage to ask questions more in my actual relationships with people I do see again. And as I've been doing that more, my friendships have gotten stronger because of it. I've even made a couple new friends from it. And you can do the same thing. You don't have to be traveling. If you're having a lot of fear to try out some of these skills, like what if you hurt one of your friends' feelings, or you upset them or something? I mean, these are just normal fears to have, because so many times we tried to engage with our mothers and were just destroyed over it. We were attacked over it. So it's normal to have these fears. The good news is, as you try them out and nothing bad happens, those fears can start to alleviate. They'll probably always still be there to some degree, but they can become small enough that they don't stop us anymore. And so if you need to, start practicing these skills on strangers when you're standing in line at a store, when you're waiting for the bus or whatever. Just start talking to people and practice, because like I said, that can get those fears to go down. And then you're able to do it in your real relationships with people that you're going to see again and again, and your relationships will become so much stronger. So let's sum it up. I really encourage you this week to sit down and evaluate the relationships in your life and ask yourself, these questions. Does the person you're in a relationship with communicate their boundaries and needs? Does the person respect your boundaries and needs? And does the person show interest in you as a person and in your life? Now, of course, we all fail at these from time to time, and we don't want to expect perfection from our friends, but just generally speaking, is this what they do? And if you have to answer no, especially, like I said, it doesn't mean that maybe they've never done these things, but if the answer is no, they usually don't do one of these things. If that's the answer to any of these questions, then you might be in a relationship that is unhealthy. Now, maybe that person has similar issues we do, and they just don't know how to develop these skills. So, of course, it'd be worth a conversation. I'm certainly not just suggesting you cut people off without any warning or even talking to them about it. That's not healthy either. But if you have that conversation and you try to express this and it blows up in your face, it might be time to consider if you should continue investing in this relationship and maybe instead invest those energies into finding new relationships where you're respected the way you deserve. But something else to think about, because as I've said, this goes both ways. So have an honest look at yourself. Do you communicate your boundaries and needs to those you have relationships with? We scapegoat children tend to not do this because we're afraid. Stating boundaries has so often resulted in a lot of pain and frustration with our narcissistic mothers because they would violate those boundaries even more or even attack us for stating a boundary. So, of course, after years of living that way, it can be very scary to do this, but it's important to practice doing this. Because if we don't, we can't have healthy relationships. And the more you do it, as I've said, the more you do it and it goes well, the less scary doing that becomes. But the second question is also important here, like we've talked about. When you then do that, does the person respect those boundaries? When you state a boundary, if what you feared does happen, that doesn't mean don't state boundaries and don't state your needs. It means that you're in an unhealthy relationship. But of course, we're talking about the other side of this question. When people communicate their boundaries and needs to you, do you respect them? Do you get upset? Do you feel attacked? Or do you see their need and make sure that you don't violate their needs? Do you understand that in those conversations, it isn't really about you? It's about their needs and their personal boundaries that all come from their own unique experiences as an individual. Every person comes to you with this big stack of experiences that are completely unique, and their needs and boundaries are going to be unique because of that. So remember that boundaries and needs aren't really about you. They're about them. And then lastly, do you express interest and care in the person and their life? Do you ask them questions? When they share their feelings with you, do you validate them and hear them? Or do you try to tell them how they should be feeling instead? And if you're thinking about this and realizing, oh my gosh, I have some really unhealthy habits in my relationships, I want to say this again. Please don't feel shame about it. It's not your fault. It'd be odd to grow up the way you did and to not have any of these issues. I would imagine all of us have had these issues, at least in the past, at some point in our lives. And if you're having any of them now still, it's okay. It's not your fault. But now you're empowered to change them. And that's something our narcissistic mothers will never have. So embrace it. Practice these skills. You can learn them. And all your relationships are going to benefit from them if they're with people who also are capable of having healthy relationships. You know, you can be unhealthy in many ways, but if you're able to do these 3 things, you're able to have healthy relationships. Of course, there's a lot of complexities to friendships and dating relationships and all kinds of relationships, but really at the core, if a relationship has these 3 things pretty consistently, it's a healthy relationship. Because this is what you need to get that relationship through complexities and through problems. I'm getting there in developing these skills. I've come a long way, and you're going to get there too. I encourage you to spend some time thinking this week on this, if any of this resonated with you. And of course, if you have questions, or maybe you disagree on something, or you have another thought that you think is really important in a healthy relationship, whatever, please share in the comments. I really love hearing from all of you. Some of you come back and comment regularly. I recognize your names. It has been so healing for me to be a part of this channel and to connect with so many of you. And these connections and dialogues we have helped me so much. A lot of you have shared insights that were really profound and just had a lot of wisdom in them that have helped me grow in my understanding. So always feel free to share in the comments. I really do love to hear from you. And I'll see you next week. And please remember, to all my fellow survivors out there, you are worthy, you are valuable, and you are beautiful, whether your mom sees that or not.